Let's keep it brief. The design conventions of RPGs, as well as just about any other gaming genre, were shaped in large part by limitations of the hardware that brought them to life. Obviously, visuals are represented with posterized pixel art, epic battles become fairly static menu screens with action readouts, world-trotting adventures turn into miniature grid-based overworld maps. These abstractions weren't unprecedented, but they became necessary due to said hardware limitations, and that is the cloth Pokémon was cut from. Among the broader gaming sphere in the mid to late 90s, Pokémon Red and Blue don't exactly stick out as presentationally cutting edge, but the concept itself, the implied world beyond the monochrome screen, that's where the magic lies. And of course, it's only natural that developers would want to better realize their vision the moment the opportunity arose, including the Pokémon devs themselves. But the more and more these abstract scenarios are expanded upon, the more games need to do to fulfill the fantasy players expect. Things that could be merely alluded to before need to be explicitly designed, programmed, and QA tested. The scope and monetary cost of a given project balloons well beyond small teams like that of Game Freak circa 1996. If you're already familiar with the core Pokémon games, you'll probably already know about the discourse surrounding the new and old entries, classic Pokémon and modern Pokémon. Whether or not you think the games became worse, it's generally understood there was a major shift in design at a certain point. A shift so significant, its impact is still felt well over a decade later. And at the epicenter of that sweeping change is 2013's Pokémon X and Y. The exact dividing line between the older and newer games can vary depending on who you ask, but I think it's fair to say that this is the first modern Pokémon game, and few other locations in X and Y embody that modernness as much as Lumiose City. Not just that, it's practically the centerpiece of the whole game. It's more or less the center of the map. It's probably what comes to mind when you think of the Kalos region. It's Paris. Even for someone like myself with minimal understanding of France beyond that one tower and the really long bread, it's pretty evident that Lumiose is heavily invested in the culture of its inspiration, down to the smallest details. Like, you have to cross the museum reception's right side to enter, and the left to exit. In order to visit the boutique in the first place, you have to build up your style, affected nebulously by various actions and tasks throughout the city. These systems aren't all passive. You need to abide by Lumiose's etiquette at numerous points. That, to me, is a pretty major defining characteristic of modern Pokémon. The core games have generally always built upon the ideas and settings from previous entries, and it's fairly easy to trace Lumiose City to X and Y's direct predecessors, Black and White. Castelia City was also the big central locale of its respective games, heavily influenced by its real-world counterpart as much as Lumiose. But there's a lot done to set the both of them apart, beyond differing inspirations. Castelia really emphasizes just how sprawling Manhattan is, by pulling the camera away from the finer details, and placing the focus on the gigantic streets, skyscrapers, and crowds which make up the broad strokes. Even the lead-up from Sky Arrow Bridge purposely outlines the dazzling spectacle waiting ahead in the distance, trucks whizzing by as you approach the biggest shakeup the series had seen at the time. It's about as idyllic a depiction of the New York skyline as a game can get. After 2001, anyway. On the other hand, Lumiose drops the viewpoint down to street level for the most part, only bringing it back up for a bird's eye view of the streets circling the Prism Tower. And in Lumiose, everything is laid out circularly. Hence the repetitious maze-like experience of trying to navigate the city, and a small dose of tussling with the camera on skates. But as genuinely kind of annoying it can be just getting around this city, I think its design is what elevates it beyond the mere presentation of a big city into actually feeling like one. If it was more standard, you wouldn't ever need to take a cab if you could easily make it to your destination for free. You gotta keep an eye out for the individual landmarks to learn your way around, in turn bringing the attention back towards the individual people of this city. And the Pokémon too. You can travel on a Go-Goat. I thought that was pretty neat. For me, at least, I find Pokémon X and Y's design approach to its central locale to hold up remarkably well. even if it exhibits some bizarre qualities by way of being an intermediary point in the series' continued evolution. Oddball control schemes and inaccessible areas still galore, which is maybe emblematic of the game as a whole, but that's sort of outside this video's scope. Still, it's quite a departure from the way the core games up to this point were designed, which inevitably leads to discontentment from those attached to the series' established identity. As I've sort of been alluding to throughout this section, it was around this time that the way real-world culture was expressed in the games had shifted. Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh are all derived from real regions in Japan, but almost every other locale afterwards were based on countries elsewhere. Hell, some newer games start with your character moving into the region, rather than already being there. You aren't merely setting out on an adventure in familiar land. You might have already turned over a new leaf before even locking eyes with your starter Pokémon, let alone another trainer. Or in other words, you're something of a tourist. It probably goes without saying that the first 4 generations took place in Japan, not as a deliberate choice for the setting, but because that's where they were developed. Japanese culture bleeds through as a byproduct of being something made by Japanese people for primarily Japanese audiences, which in practice means a more plain JRPG presentation, albeit set in a contemporary time period. Sure, there's some stuff like the definitely not a Buddhist shrine in Celadon City, but that's more or less as far as it goes, culturally. Modern Pokémon, in comparison, is a whole other beast with its cultural inspirations. Quite literally, in some cases. But that isn't to say that's necessarily a bad thing. To bring it back around to the main subject, Lumiose may not have a Sky Arrow Bridge moment, but what it lacks in sheer bombasticness, it makes up for in what underlies the exterior. You know, something like the post-game Looker quest, revolving around an orphan girl getting caught up in shady operations to try and get by in the city, eventually taking up the mantle of Lumiose's detective herself once Looker takes his leave. A brief but somewhat heartfelt storyline set entirely within the confines of a single city centered around the people and Pokémon inhabiting it? Nah, there's probably not much merit to that. You can toss that idea straight into the never happening bin, alongside Pokémon Z and any sort of evolution for Raichu, is what I would have said, had it not been for the transpiring of a rather unfortunate event. The French won. Looking back at Legends Arceus, I think it's clear why Lumiose City became the setting for another Legends game. Despite Jubilife Village not being nearly as expansive, the side quests and overall sense of community feels pretty in line with Lumiose's nature in the original games. There's something innately appealing to compounding upon what was ultimately a fraction of an otherwise fairly typical Pokémon game, into a much richer and in-depth locale with all sorts of new nooks and crannies to explore, blending the town life of Jubilife and the natural environments of the wild areas into one decently sizable interconnected map. Quite literally, that blend of urbanism and nature is what ZA's story is founded upon. But we aren't on the 3DS anymore, arguably not even a proper handheld. It's 2025 now, the times are different, and is this game really a sensible move for the series? Well, I'm a Pokémon sicko, so you shouldn't take my word with too much weight. As I said, I personally find the appeal in a fully city-centric Pokémon to be pretty innate. It's sorta like the movies with their incredibly elaborate European-inspired settings. Honestly, half the appeal of watching them is going on virtual Pokémon-themed vacations. But with the focus placed on a single urban environment, the typical feeling of adventure you'd expect from prior mainline entries innately wanes. Even when Legends Arceus made you return to a central town periodically, it still presented entirely new wild areas as you made progress. And as benign a concept as ZA's single locale might seem, it's become yet another part of the snowballing discourse around modern Pokémon. Scarlet and Violet were very troubled games, to put it lightly, and when ZA was announced in 2024, over a year out from release, it seemed like it could be a massive step up in presentational polish from its predecessors. Of course, when that second trailer rolled around, it became immediately apparent that this was just another Pokémon game for the Switch, on a visual level at least. It's not dazzling, it's not falling apart at the seams, This initial look at ZA isn't something that would stick out in a sizzle reel, for better or worse. The high player expectations brought on by a multitude of factors weren't exactly met. Henceforth, the aforementioned snowballing animosity haunting the narrative since 2019 or so, as these games have tried to adapt into bigger home console experiences. That's not to dismiss any and all criticism leveled against the games, but the amount of constant backlash leading up to and after release can feel comically disproportionate at times, in some cases tending to overshadow discussion of other aspects about these games, which is lame. Over time, the general sentiment surrounding ZA has shifted more positively, but the burden of being a modern Pokémon game in modern times still hangs over it. So, to stop beating around the bush, what's good with Lumiose City and Pokémon Legends ZA? After a brief glimpse at an unknown power surging through Prism Tower, we open up with the protagonists moving into I hope you've been keeping track. You are the biggest bold text tourist Lumiose City has seen, and you get thrown rather quickly into the meat of what it has to offer. At least, to the extent that your rival, Miss 1984, wants you to, or Mr. As you'd expect, Lumiose City is a lot bigger than it was on the 3DS, but also a lot more layered as well. There's cliff faces that vary up the horizon line, rooftops that can be hopped across, bridges overhanging rivers below, stairs leading down to said rivers where water Pokémon lie. The open world game design strips out most, if not all, invisible walls that once precisely dictated where you could go, enabling some of the most freeform exploration the core games have seen yet, punctuated by fully seamless transitions into and out of battles. Pokémon interactions in general exist as a natural extension of the locale. Even with the Wild Zone barriers containing a good portion of them, you might still find a stray Pokémon elsewhere ready to be caught, or ready to kick your ass. And on the note of getting your rear handed, you might get caught by an imposing trainer after nightfall during the titular ZA Royale, a tournament held in a randomly designated battle zone where whoever rises up to A rank gets to have a wish granted. Participant motivation swinging wildly from, I want a really big lollipop, to actual fascism. I don't think most people here have fought their wishes through in the slightest. It's definitely not concerning at all that the literal zoning of Lumiose is being carried out by a private corporate entity on a whim, with little to no input from its residents, or even what's best for the Pokémon themselves. But hey, a bit of institutional corruption makes for a fun video game. And there's no better way to have fun in an action RPG than customizing your character. If you dress woke in Lumiose, you go broke. If you dress up whatsoever, you still go broke. Though unlike the original games, there are thankfully plentiful more budget-friendly options for styling your character in the city. Really, a lot more clothing options in general, so my personal lapse in judgment is not a mandatory one. Whether you're sifting through overpriced clothes, sneaking up to trainers in alleyways, or getting your shit kicked by an alpha Pokémon, ZA's Lumiose City never fails to feel and function like one cohesive setting. The individual parts intermingle like clockwork, while still providing the agency to simply mess around in a big city. Maybe it's the Switch 2 edition doing some of the heavy lifting, but the environments rarely felt downright ugly, unlike previous open-world endeavors in this series. They can be, dare I say, really nice at points, especially areas with dense foliage. I don't find myself constantly blown away by graphical beauty, but what elegance is present leverages the sensation of eagerly dashing through street corners, or simply winding down at a cafe with your little guy. God, this game exudes millennial energy, and I'm afraid to say, I quite like that. ZA even harkens back to the mechanics of older Pokémon games, namely with overworld field moves being performed by your party members, highlighting your bond with individual Pokémon without necessarily needing to commit to a homogenized moveset. Rock Smash not required for smashing rocks. Really, one of the only major limits to this trip to Lumiose is the sparsity of enterable buildings. But it feels less egregious compared to something like Scarlet and Violet, because there's inherently much more to do in ZA's single city, in a way that does keep the momentum of the gameplay going, without regularly needing to exit and re-enter the main map. And also, you still can't go surfing into the canals, or any pools of water for that matter. I don't know, maybe they're saving them for Pokémon Legends Dasani. Despite some minor setbacks, ZA's version of Lumiose manages to compound on that city life feeling from the original X and Y significantly through its layered and emergent design. The gradual introduction of more wild zones, I think, goes a long way towards keeping a concept like this fresh in execution, recontextualizing previous areas in a new, perilous light. Even having sunken nearly 30 hours into this game, it's still yet to lose its luster for me, something even Legends Arceus struggled a little with. Without treading into spoiler territory, since ZA is still fairly new, I really loved what they did with all the intersecting factions, butting heads as you climb the ranks, slowly but surely interweaving with the larger mystery surrounding Lumiose's wild Pokémon influx. In general, your main friend group, Team MZ, feels a lot less one-note than in X and Y, the strategy meetings serving as a fun way to get to know them better, and to gaze at the hellish culinary amalgams that lie before you. X and Y might have not been the strongest story to begin with, but they absolutely delivered with how they built on those events and characters, the things that continue to ripple out years later, if you get what I mean. ZA being set in a single city makes it a very particular kind of game, and it might not be for everyone. Well, it'll definitely still sell millions, but its flavor of Pokémon adventure will either immediately click with you, or it won't. And I like that kind of experimentation with the formula. It might seem a bit dull and or repetitive, but Lumiose City's greatest strengths once again shine through its intricacies and being somewhat low-key. I guess the French aren't so bad, after all. Seriously, what's there to take away from all this? As you might expect, it's sort of difficult to gauge the inner workings of billion-dollar multimedia franchises, to make sweeping claims about where the process is going wrong that makes the trees look bad, or the cutscenes voiceless, or why the games just don't resonate with you like they used to. While not exclusively because of nostalgia, a lot of the main complaints going around as the games themselves have come around share the common thread of immersion. The first few Pokémon games imply a massive boundless fantasy using so little, but with the transition to 3D, the seams of this abstract game formula become innately more apparent, ironically enough, leaving a lot less up to imagination. We all want to be immersed in this strange world with its strange creatures, but these games can tend to trip over their own expansiveness in the name of realizing their grandeur. And X and Y as the games that took the full leap into 3D are emblematic of, no, a lightning rod for the series' perceived shortcomings. You still hear echoes of how the idle animations of flying-type Pokémon are too samey, the game balance being overly in the player's favor, character dialogue being a wordy obstacle to mash through. Most, if not all, these things can be traced back to those 12-year-old 3DS games. Wanting the core Pokémon games to live up to the polish of other modern games isn't unreasonable, but the cyclical discourse tending to follow up that sentiment, like they should have stuck with 2D, or going open world was a mistake, can feel misguided at best, but more often dismissive towards any potential growth. Greninja is one of my favorite Pokémon, and the nuance in its behavior in and out of battle would be lost outside of other media if it weren't for the 3D models making that sort of expressiveness possible on a scale of literally hundreds of creature designs, even if the full extent of which is partly exclusive to optional side modes. I could go on about how these models so faithfully adapt the 2D art's coloring, down to the minutiae of the cell shading and whatnot, but I'll refrain from doing more X and Y apologism than I already have. Look, I get it. I understand why people have found this series so frustrating the past couple years, whether it's the National Dex controversy, BDSP's crude interpretation of the original's character, the plainly evident deep-rooted technical problems of Scarlet and Violet, but we need to approach that frustration in a way that's healthier for the community at large, and maybe a little less so in the form of non-stop vitriol and doom posting, especially when it's directed towards the real-ass human beings making these games. Not that that in particular is representative of all criticism, but these things can easily snowball without some amount of discipline. The Switch era of Pokémon has been characterized by some of the most rapid change the core games have seen. From Legends Arceus to ZA, these most recent entries have felt genuinely exciting, knowing they're only scratching the surface for what a true-to-life Pokémon game could offer. Even if that volatility has been a double-edged sword for consistently high-quality output. And Lumiose 2 has seen rapid change in the years since our first trip there, reshaping itself into a city suited more equally for the humans and Pokémon which inhabit it, even if reaching that utopic ideal hasn't entirely been smooth sailing. Obviously, one of these things is leading the charge on the most profitable media franchise in the world, and the other is in a fake video game for stupid children. But as someone who's felt reluctant about the series' current direction before, who wasn't all that interested in Scarlet and Violet at launch because of its technical woes, embracing what is different from what you once loved about the games, maybe something that does kind of suck a little? If you embrace a little Lumiose City, flat windows and all, there may be a really solid experience waiting on the other side of that train station's reception gate. As long as you cross from the correct side, anyway.